Chapter 11 Duar, I got little sleep that night. My officers were constantly coming to me with reports. From these I learned what was of the greatest importance to me, the temper of the crew. None was averse to taking the Sovong, but there was a divergence of opinion as to what we should do thereafter. A few wanted to be landed on Thorin's soil so that they could make their way back to their homes. The majority was enthusiastic about plundering merchant ships. The idea of exploring the unknown waters of Amtor filled most of them with fear. Some were averse to restoring the Vepajan prisoners to their own country, and there was an active and extremely vocal minority that insisted that the command of the vessel should be placed in the hands of Thorins. In this I could see the hand of Kodj, even before they told me that the suggestion had come from the coterie that formed his following. "But there are fully 100, said Gamfer, "upon whose loyalty you may depend. These have accepted you as their leader, and they will follow you and obey your commands. Arm these," I directed, "and place all others below deck until after we have taken the Sovong. How about the Klangen? They took no part in the mutiny. Are they for us or against us?" Chiron laughed. "They received no orders one way or the other," he explained. "They have no initiative. Unless they are motivated by such primitive instincts as hunger, love, or hate, they do nothing without orders from a superior." "And they don't care who their master is," interjected Zog. "They serve loyally enough until their master dies, or sells them, or gives them away, or is overthrown. Then they transfer the same loyalty to a new master." "They have been told that you are their new master," said Camlot, "and they will obey you." As there were only 5 of the birdmen aboard the Sofal, I had not been greatly exercised about their stand, but I was glad to learn that they would not be antagonistic. At the 20th hour, I ordered the 100 upon whom we could depend assembled and held in the lower deck house, the others having all been confined below earlier in the night, in the accomplishment of which a second mutiny was averted only by the fact that all the men had been previously disarmed, except the loyal soldiers of liberty. All during the night we had been gradually gaining upon the unsuspecting Sovong, until now we were scarcely 100 yards astern of her, slightly aport. Across our starboard bow I could see her looming darkly in the mysterious nocturnal glow of the moonless Amtorian night, her lanterns white and coloured points of light, her watch dimly visible upon her decks. Closer and closer the Sofal crept toward her prey. A soldier of liberty, who had once been an officer in the Thorin navy, was at the wheel. No one was on deck but the members of the watch. In the lower deck house 100 men were huddled waiting for the command to board. I stood beside Honan in the chart room. He was to command the Sofal, while I led the boarding party, my eyes upon the strange Amtorian chronometer. I spoke a word to him, and he moved a lever. The Sofal crept a little closer to the Sovong. Then Honan whispered an order to the helmsman, and we closed in upon our prey. I hastened down the companionway to the main deck, and gave the signal to Camlot standing in the doorway of the deck-house. The 2 ships were close now, and almost abreast. The sea was calm. Only a gentle swell raised and lowered the softly gliding ships. Now we were so close that a man could step across the intervening space from the deck of one ship to that of the other. The officer of the watch aboard the Sovong hailed us. "What are you about?" he demanded. "Sheer off there!" For answer I ran across the deck of the Sofal and leaped aboard the other ship, 100 silent men following in my wake. There was no shouting and little noise, only the shuffling of sandalled feet and the subdued clank of arms. Behind us the grappling hooks were thrown over the rail of the Sovong. Every man had been instructed as to the part he was to play. Leaving Camlot in command on the main deck, I ran to the tower deck with 12 men, while Chiron led a score of fighting men to the second deck where most of the officers were quartered. Before the officer of the watch could gather his scattered wits, I had him covered with a pistol. "Keep quiet," I whispered, "and you will not be harmed." My plan was to take as many of them as possible before a general alarm could be sounded, and thus minimize the necessity for bloodshed, therefore the need for silence. I turned him over to one of my men after disarming him, and then I sought the captain, while 2 of my detachment attended to the helmsman. I found the officer for whom I sought, reaching for his weapons. He had been awakened by the unavoidable noise of the boarding party, and, suspecting that something was amiss, had seized his weapons as he arose and uncovered the lights in his cabin. I was upon him as he raised his pistol and struck it from his hand before he could fire, but he stepped back with his sword on guard, and thus we stood facing one another for a moment. "Surrender," I told him, "and you will not be harmed." "Who are you?" he demanded, "and where did you come from?" "I was a prisoner on board the Sofal," I replied, "but now I command her. If you wish to avoid bloodshed, come out on deck with me and give the command to surrender." "And then what?" he demanded. "Why have you boarded us if not to kill? To take off provisions, weapons, and the Vepigen prisoners," I explained. Suddenly the hissing staccato of pistol fire came up to us from the deck below. "I thought there was to be no killing," he snapped. "If you want to stop it, get out there and give the command to surrender," I replied. "I don't believe you." He cried, "It's a trick!" and he came at me with his sword. I did not wish to shoot him down in cold blood, and so I met his attack with my own blade. The advantage was on his side in the matter of skill, for I had not fully accustomed myself to the use of the Amtorian sword, but I had an advantage in strength and reach and in some tricks of German swordplay that I had learned while I was in Germany. The Amtorian sword is primarily a cutting weapon, its weight near the tip making it particularly effective for this method of attack, though it lessens its effectiveness in parrying thrusts, rendering it a rather sluggish defensive weapon. I therefore found myself facing a savage cutting attack against which I had difficulty in defending myself. The officer was an active man and skillful with the sword. Being experienced, it did not take him long to discover I was a novice, with the result that he pressed his advantage viciously, so that I soon regretted my magnanimity in not resorting to my pistol before the encounter began. But it was too late now. The fellow kept me so busy that I had no opportunity to draw the weapon. He forced me back and around the room until he stood between me and the doorway, and then, having me where no chance for escape remained, he set to work to finish me with dispatch. The duel, as far as I was concerned, was fought wholly on the defensive. So swift and persistent was his attack that I could only defend myself, and not once in the first 2 minutes of the encounter did I aim a single blow at him. I wondered what had become of the men who had accompanied me, but pride would not permit me to call upon them for help, nor did I learn until later that it would have availed me nothing, since they were having all that they could attend to in repelling the attack of several officers who had run up from below immediately behind them. The teeth of my antagonist were bared in a grim and ferocious smile as he battered relentlessly at my guard as though he already sensed victory and was gloating in anticipation. The clanging of steel on steel now drowned all sounds from beyond the 4 walls of the cabin where we fought. I could not tell if fighting were continuing in other parts of the ship, nor, if it were, whether it were going in our favor or against us. I realized that I must know these things, that I was responsible for whatever took place aboard the Sovong, and that I must get out of that cabin and lead my men either in victory or defeat. Such thoughts made my position even more impossible than as though only my life were at stake, and drove me to attempt heroic measures for releasing myself from my predicament and my peril. I must destroy my adversary, and I must do so at once. He had me now with my back almost against the wall. Already his point had touched me upon the cheek once and twice upon the body, and though the wounds were but scratches, I was covered with blood. Now he leaped upon me in a frenzy of determination to have done with me instantly, but this time I did not fall back. I parried his cut, so that his sword passed to the right of my body, which was now close to his, and then I drew back my point, and before he could recover himself, drove it through his heart. As he sagged to the floor, I jerked my sword from his body and ran from his cabin. The entire episode had required but a few minutes, though it had seemed much longer to me, yet in that brief time much had occurred on the decks and in the cabins of the Sovong. The upper decks were cleared of living enemies. One of my own men was at the wheel, another at the controls. there was still fighting on the main deck, where some of the Sauvagne's officers were making a desperate last stand with a handful of their men. But by the time I reached the scene of the battle, it was over. The officers, assured by Camelot that their lives would be spared, had surrendered. The Sauvagne was ours. The Saufol had taken her first prize. As I sprang into the midst of the excited warriors on the main deck, I must have presented a sorry spectacle, bleeding, as I was, from my 3 wounds, but my men greeted me with loud cheers. I learned later that my absence from the fighting on the main deck had been noticed and had made a poor impression on my men, but when they saw me return bearing the scars of combat, my place in their esteem was secured. Those 3 little scratches proved of great value to me, but they were as nothing in comparison with the psychological effect produced by the wholly disproportionate amount of blood they had spilled upon my naked hide. We now quickly rounded up our prisoners and disarmed them. Camelot took a detachment of men and released the Vepagin captives, whom he transferred at once to the Saufol. They were nearly all women, but I did not see them as they were taken from the ship, being engaged with other matters. I could imagine, though, the joy in the hearts of Camelot and Douare at this reunion, which the latter at least had probably never even dared to hope for. Rapidly we transferred all of the small arms of the Sauvagne to the Saufol, leaving only sufficient to equip the officers of the ill-starred vessel. This work was entrusted to Chiron and was carried out by our own men, while Gamfor, with a contingent of our new-made prisoners, carried all of the Sauvagne's surplus provisions aboard our own ship. This done, I ordered all the Sauvagne's guns thrown overboard. By that much at least I would cripple the power of Thora. The last act in this drama of the sea was to march our 100 imprisoned malcontents from the Saufol to the Sauvagne and present them to the latter's new commander with my compliments. He did not seem greatly pleased, however, nor could I blame him. Neither were the prisoners pleased. Many of them begged me to take them back aboard the Saufol, but I already had more men than I felt were needed to navigate and defend the ship, and each of the prisoners had been reported as having expressed disapproval of some part or all of our plan, so that I, who must have absolute loyalty and cooperation, considered them valueless to me. Kodj, strange to say, was the most persistent. He almost went on his knees as he pleaded with me to permit him to remain with the Saufol, and he promised me such loyalty as man had never known before, but I had had enough of Kodj and told him so. Then, when he found that I could not be moved, he turned upon me, swearing by all his ancestors that he would get even with me yet, even though it took 1,000 years. Returning to the deck of the Saufol, I ordered the grappling hooks cast off, and presently the 2 ships were under way again, the Sauvagne proceeding toward the Thoran port that was her destination, the Saufol back toward Vepagin. Now, for the first time, I had opportunity to inquire into our losses and found that we had suffered 4 killed and 21 wounded, the casualties among the crew of the Sauvagne having been much higher. For the greater part of the remainder of the day, I was busy with my officers organizing the personnel of the Saufol and systematizing the activities of this new and unfamiliar venture, in which work Chiron and Gamfor were of inestimable value, and it was not until late in the afternoon that I had an opportunity to inquire into the welfare of the rescued Vepagin captives. When I asked Camelot about them, he said that they were none the worse for their captivity aboard the Sauvagne. You see, these raiding parties have orders to bring the women to Thora unharmed and in good condition, he explained. They are destined for more important persons than ship's officers, and that is their safeguard. However, Douare said that notwithstanding this, the captain made advances to her. I wish I might have known it while I was still aboard the Sauvagne, that I might have killed him for his presumption. Camelot's tone was bitter, and he showed signs of unusual excitement. "Let your mind rest at ease," I begged him. "Douare has been avenged." "What do you mean?" "I killed the captain myself," I explained. He clapped a hand upon my shoulder, his eyes alight with pleasure. "Again you have won the undying gratitude of Vepagin," he cried. "I wish that it might have been my good fortune to have killed the beast, and thus wiped out the insult upon Vepagin. But if I could not be the one, then I am glad that it was you, Carson, rather than another. I thought that he took the matter rather seriously and was placing too much importance upon the action of the Sovong's captain, since it had resulted in no harm to the girl. But then, of course, I realized that love plays strange tricks upon a man's mental processes, so that an affront to a mistress might be magnified to the proportions of a national calamity. "Well, it is all over now," I said, "and your sweetheart has been returned to you safe and sound." At that he looked horrified. "My sweetheart?" he exclaimed. "In the name of the ancestors of all the Jongs, do you mean to tell me that you do not know who Duar is?" "I thought, of course, that she was the girl you loved," I confessed. "Who is she?" "Of course I love her," he explained. "All Vepaja loves her. She is the virgin daughter of a Vepayan Jong." Had he been announcing the presence of a goddess on shipboard, his tone could have been no more reverential and awed. I endeavoured to appear more impressed than I was, lest I offend him. "Had she been the woman of your choice," I said, "I should have been even more pleased to have had a part in her rescue than had she been the daughter of a dozen Jongs." "That is nice of you," he replied, "but do not let other Vepans hear you say such things. You have told me of the divinities of that strange world from which you come. The persons of the Jong and his children are similarly sacred to us." "Then, of course, they shall be sacred to me," I assured him. "By the way, I have word for you that should please you. A Vepajan would consider it a high honor. Duar desires to see you that she may thank you personally. It is irregular, of course, but then circumstances have rendered strict adherence to the etiquette and customs of our country impracticable, if not impossible. Several hundred men already have looked upon her, many have spoken to her, and nearly all of them were enemies. So it can do no harm if she sees and speaks with her defenders and her friends." I did not understand what he was driving at, but I assented to what he had said and told him that I would pay my respects to the princess before the day was over. I was very busy, and if the truth must be told, I was not particularly excited about visiting the princess. In fact, I rather dreaded it, for I am not particularly keen about fawning and kowtowing to royalty or anything else, but I decided that out of respect for Camlot's feelings, I must get the thing over as soon as possible, and after he had left to attend to some duty, I made my way to the quarters allotted to Duar on the second deck. The Amtorians do not knock on a door, they whistle. It is rather an improvement, I think, upon our custom. One has one's own distinctive whistle. Some of them are quite elaborate airs. One soon learns to recognize the signals of one's friends. A knock merely informs you that someone wishes to enter. A whistle tells you the same thing and also reveals the identity of your caller. My signal, which is very simple, consists of 2 short low notes followed by a higher longer note. And as I stood before the door of Duare and sounded this, my mind was not upon the princess within, but upon another girl far away in the tree city of Koad, in Vepaja. She was often in my mind, the girl whom I had glimpsed but twice, to whom I had spoken but once, and that time to avow a love that had enveloped me as completely, spontaneously, and irrevocably as would death upon some future day. In response to my signal, a soft, feminine voice bade me enter. I stepped into the room and faced Duar. At sight of me, her eyes went wide and a quick flush mounted her cheeks. "You!" she exclaimed. I was equally dumbfounded. She was the girl from the Garden of the Jong. Chapter 12, a ship! What a strange contretemps! Its suddenness left me temporarily speechless. The embarrassment of Duar was only too obvious. Yet it was that unusual paradox, a happy contretemps, for me at least. I advanced toward her, and there must have been a great deal more in my eyes than I realized, for she shrank back, flushing even more deeply than before. "Don't touch me," she whispered. "Don't dare! Have I ever harmed you?" I asked. That question seemed to bring her confidence. She shook her head. "No," she admitted. "You never have physically. I sent for you to thank you for the service you have already rendered me, but I did not know it was you. I did not know that the Carson they spoke of was the man who—" She stopped there and looked at me appealingly. "The man who told you in the Garden of the Jong that he loved you," I prompted her. "Don't!" she cried. "Can it be that you do not realize the offensiveness, the criminality of such a declaration?" "Is it a crime to love you?" I asked. "It is a crime to tell me so," she replied with something of haughtiness. "Then I am a confirmed criminal," I replied, "for I cannot help telling you that I love you whenever I see you." "If that is the case, you must not see me again, for you must never again speak those words to me," she said decisively. "Because of the service you have rendered me, I forgive you your past offences, but do not repeat them." "What if I can't help it?" I inquired. "You must help it," she stated seriously. "It is a matter of life and death to you." Her words puzzled me. "I do not understand what you mean," I admitted. "Camelot, Honan, any of the Vepajans aboard this ship would kill you if they knew," she replied. "The Jong, my father, would have you destroyed upon our return to Vapaja. It would all depend upon whom I told first." I came a little closer to her and looked straight into her eyes. "You would never tell," I whispered. "Why not? What makes you think that?" she demanded, but her voice quavered a little. "Because you want me to love you," I challenged her. She stamped her foot angrily. "You are beyond reason, or forbearance, or decency," she exclaimed. "Leave my cabin at once. I do not wish ever to see you again." Her bosom was heaving, her beautiful eyes were flashing. She was very close to me, and an impulse seized me to take her in my arms. I wanted to crush her body to mine. I wanted to cover her lips with kisses. But more than all else, I wanted her love, and so I restrained myself for fear that I might go too far and lose the chance to win the love that I felt was hovering just below the threshold of her consciousness. I do not know why I was so sure of that, but I was. I could not have brought myself to force my attentions upon a woman to whom they were repugnant. But from the first moment that I had seen this girl watching me from the garden in Vapaja, I had been impressed by an inner consciousness of her interest in me, her more than simple interest. It was just one of those things that are the children of old Chankabi's training, a training that has made me infinitely more intuitive than a woman. "I am sorry that you are sending me away into virtual exile," I said. "I do not feel that I deserve that, but of course the standards of your world are not the standards of mine. There a woman is not dishonored by the love of a man or by its avowal unless she is already married to another." And then of a sudden a thought occurred to me that should have occurred before. "Do you already belong to some man?" I demanded, chilled by the thought. "Of course not," she snapped. "I am not yet 19. I wondered that it had never before occurred to me that the girl in the garden of the Jong might be already married. I did not know what that had to do with it, but I was glad to learn that she was not 700 years old. I had often wondered about her age, though after all it could have made no difference, since on Venus, if anywhere in the universe, people are really no older than they look. I mean, as far as their attractiveness is concerned. "Are you going?" she demanded, "or shall I have to call one of the Vapojuns and tell them that you have affronted me, and have me killed?" I asked no. "You cannot make me believe that you would ever do that." "Then I shall leave," she stated, "and remember that you are never to see me or speak to me again." With that parting and far from cheering ultimatum, she quit the room, going into another of her suite. That appeared to end the interview. I could not very well follow her, and so I turned and made my way disconsolately to the captain's cabin in the tower. As I thought the matter over, it became obvious to me that I not only had not made much progress in my suit, but that there was little likelihood that I ever should. There seemed to be some insuperable barrier between us, though what it was I could not imagine. I could not believe that she was entirely indifferent to me, but perhaps that was just a reflection of my egotism, for I had to admit that she had certainly made it plain enough both by words and acts that she wished to have nothing to do with me. I was unquestionably persona non grata. Notwithstanding all this, or maybe because of it, I realized that this second and longer interview had but served to raise my passion to still greater heat, leaving me in a fine state of despair. Her near presence on board the Sofal was constantly provocative, while her interdiction of any relations between us only tended to make me more anxious to be with her. I was most unhappy, and the monotony of the now uneventful voyage back toward Vepaya offered no means of distraction. I wished that we might sight another vessel, for any ship that we sighted would be an enemy ship. We were outlaws, we of the Sofol, pirates, buccaneers, privateers. I rather leaned toward the last and most polite definition of our status. Of course, we had not as yet been commissioned by Mintep to raid shipping for Vipaja, but we were striking at Vipaja's enemies, and so I felt that we had some claim upon the dubious respectability of privateerism. However, either of the other two titles would not have greatly depressed me. Buccaneer has a devil-may-care ring to it that appeals to my fancy. It has a trifle more haut-ton than pirate. There is much in a name. I had liked the name of the Sofal from the first. Perhaps it was the psychology of that name that suggested the career upon which I was now launched. It means killer. The verb meaning kill is fal. The prefix so has the same value as the suffix ir in English, so Sofal means killer. Vong is the Amtorian word for defend. Therefore, Sovong, the name of our first prize, means defender. But the Sovong had not lived up to her name. I was still meditating on names in an effort to forget Duar when Camlot joined me, and I decided to take the opportunity to ask him some questions concerning certain Amtorian customs that regulated the social intercourse between men and maids. He opened a way to the subject by asking me if I had seen Duar since she sent for me. I saw her, I replied, but I do not understand her attitude, which suggested that it was almost a crime for me to look at her. It would be under ordinary circumstances, he told me. But of course, as I explained to you before, what she and we have passed through has temporarily at least minimized the importance of certain time-honored weapon laws and customs. Vepajan girls attain their majority at the age of 20. Prior to that, they may not form a union with a man. The custom, which has almost the force of a law, places even greater restrictions upon the daughters of a Jong. They may not even see or speak to any man other than their blood relatives and a few well-chosen retainers until after they have reached their 20th birthday. Should they transgress, it would mean disgrace for them and death for the man. "What a fool law!" I ejaculated, but I realized at last how heinous my transgression must have appeared in the eyes of Duar. Camlot shrugged. "It may be a fool law," he said, "but it is still the law. And in the case of Duare, its enforcement means much to Vipaja, for she is the hope of Vipaja." I had heard that title conferred upon her before, but it was meaningless to me. "Just what do you mean by saying that she is the hope of Vipaja?" I asked. "She is Mintep's only child. He has never had a son, though 100 women have sought to bear him one. The life of the dynasty ends if Duar bears no son, and if she is to bear a son, then it is essential that the father of that son be one fitted to be the father of a Jong." "Have they selected the father of her children yet?" I asked. "Of course not," replied Camlot. "The matter will not even be broached until after Duar has passed her 20th birthday. And she is not even 19 yet." I remarked with a sigh. "No," agreed Camlot, eyeing me closely, "but you act as though that fact were of importance to you." "It is," I admitted. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "I intend to marry Duar." Camlot leaped to his feet and whipped out his sword. It was the first time that I had ever seen him show marked excitement. I thought he was going to kill me on the spot. "Defend yourself," he cried. "I cannot kill you until you draw." "Just why do you wish to kill me at all?" I demanded. "Have you gone crazy?" The point of Camlot's sword dropped slowly toward the floor. "I do not wish to kill you," he said rather sadly, all the nervous excitement gone from his manner. "You are my friend. You have saved my life. No, I would rather die myself than kill you, but the thing you have just said demands it." I shrugged my shoulders. The thing was inexplicable to me. "What did I say that demands death?" I demanded. "That you intend to marry Duar?" "In my world," I told him, "men are killed for saying that they do not intend to marry some girl." I had been sitting at the desk in my cabin at the time that Camlot had threatened me, and I had not arisen. Now I stood up and faced him. "You had better kill me, Camlot," I said, "for I spoke the truth." He hesitated for a moment, standing there looking at me. Then he returned his sword to its scabbard. "I cannot," he said huskily. "May my ancestors forgive me. I cannot kill my friend. Perhaps," he added, seeking some extenuating circumstance, "you should not be held accountable to customs of which you had no knowledge. I often forget that you are of another world than ours. But tell me, now that I have made myself a party to your crime by excusing it, what leads you to believe that you will marry Duare? I can incriminate myself no more by listening to you further. I intend to marry her because I know that I love her and believe that she already half loves me. At this, Camelot appeared shocked and horrified again. That is impossible, he cried. She never saw you before. She cannot dream what is in your heart or your mad brain. On the contrary, she has seen me before, and she knows quite well what is in my mad brain, I assured him. I told her in Coad. I told her again today. And she listened. She was shocked, I admitted, but she listened. Then she upbraided me and ordered me from her presence. Camelot breathed a sigh of relief. At least she has not gone mad. I cannot understand on what you base your belief that she may return your love. Her eyes betrayed her, and what may be more convincing, she did not expose my perfidy and thus send me to my death. He pondered that and shook his head. It is all madness, he said. I can make nothing of it. You say that you talked with her in Coad, but that would have been impossible. But if you had ever even seen her before, why did you show so little interest in her fate when you knew that she was a prisoner aboard the Sauvong? Why did you say that you thought that she was my sweetheart? I did not know until a few minutes ago, I explained, that the girl I saw and talked with in the garden at Coad was Duare, the daughter of the Jong. A few days later I was again talking with Camelot in my cabin when we were interrupted by a whistle at the door, and when I bade him do so, one of the Vapourgen prisoners that we had rescued from the Sauvong entered. He was not from Coad, but from another city of Vapourja, and therefore none of the other Vapourgens aboard knew anything concerning him. His name was Villor, and he appeared to be a decent sort of fellow, though rather inclined to taciturnity. He had manifested considerable interest in the Clangons, and was with them often, but had explained this idiosyncrasy on the grounds that he was a scholar and wished to study the birdmen, specimens of which he had never before seen. I have come, he explained in response to my inquiry, to ask you to appoint me an officer. I should like to join your company and share in the work and responsibilities of the expedition. We are well officered now, I explained, and have all the men we need. Furthermore, I added frankly, I do not know you well enough to be sure of your qualifications. By the time we reach Vapourja we shall be better acquainted, and if I need you then I will tell you. Well, I should like to do something, he insisted. May I guard the Janjong until we reach Vapourja? He referred to Duare, whose title, compounded of the two words daughter and king, is synonymous with princess. I thought that I noticed just a trace of excitement in his voice as he made the request. She is well guarded now, I explained, but I should like to do it, he insisted. It would be a service of love and loyalty for my Jong. I could stand the night guard. No one likes that detail ordinarily. It will not be necessary, I said shortly. The guard is already sufficient. She is in the after cabins of the second deck house, is she not? He asked. I told him that she was. And she has a special guard? A man is always before her door at night, I assured him. Only one, he demanded, as though he thought the guard insufficient. In addition to the regular watch, we consider one man enough. She has no enemies aboard the Sofal. These people were certainly solicitous of the welfare and safety of their royalty, I thought, and it seemed to me unnecessarily so. But finally Villor gave up and departed after begging me to give his request further thought. He seems even more concerned about the welfare of Duar than you, I remarked to Camelot after Villor had gone. Yes, I noticed that, replied my lieutenant thoughtfully. There is no one more concerned about her than I said, but I cannot see that any further precautions are necessary. Nor I, agreed Camelot. She is quite well protected now. We had dropped Villor from our minds and were discussing other matters when we heard the voice of the lookout in the crow's nest shouting, "Vunota! A ship!" Running to the tower deck, we got the bearings of the stranger as the lookout announced them the second time, and sure enough, almost directly A-beam on the starboard side, we discerned the superstructure of a ship on the horizon. For some reason which I do not clearly understand, the visibility on Venus is usually exceptionally good. Low fogs and haze are rare, notwithstanding the humidity of the atmosphere. This condition may be due to the mysterious radiation from that strange element in the planet's structure which illuminates her moonless nights. I do not know. At any rate, we could see a ship, and almost immediately all was excitement aboard the Sofal. Here was another prize, and the men were eager to be at her. As we changed our course and headed for our victim, a cheer rose from the men on deck. Weapons were issued, the bow gun and the 2 tower guns were elevated to firing positions. The Sofal forged ahead at full speed. As we approached our quarry, we saw that it was a ship of about the same size as the Sofal and bearing the insignia of Thora. Closer inspection revealed it to be an armed merchantman. I now ordered all but the gunners into the lower deck house, as I planned on boarding vessel as I had the Sauvong and did not wish her to see our deck filled with armed men before we came alongside. As before, explicit orders were issued. Every man knew what was expected of him. All were cautioned against needless killing. If I were to be a pirate, I was going to be as humane a pirate as possible. I would not spill blood needlessly. I had questioned Chiron, Gamfor, and many another Thoran in my company relative to the customs and practices of Thoran ships of war until I felt reasonably familiar with them. I knew, for instance, that a warship might search a merchantman. It was upon this that I based my hope of getting our grappling hooks over the side of our victim before he could suspect our true design. When we were within hailing distance of the ship, I directed Chiron to order her to shut down her engines, as we wished to board and search her, and right then we ran into our first obstacle. It came in the form of a pennant suddenly hoisted at the bow of our intended victim. It meant nothing to me, but it did to Chiron and the other Thorans aboard the Sofal. "We'll not board her so easily, after all," said Chiron. "She has an Onjan on board, and that exempts her from search. It probably also indicates that she carries a larger complement of soldiers than a merchantman ordinarily does." "Whose friend?" I asked. "Yours, for Onjan means great friend in the sense of eminent or exalted." Chiron smiled. "It is a title. There are 100 Klongyan in the oligarchy. One of them is aboard that ship. They are great friends, unquestionably great friends of themselves. They rule Thora more tyrannically than any Jong, and for themselves alone." "How will the men feel about attacking a ship bearing so exalted a personage?" I inquired. "They will fight among themselves to be the first aboard and to run a sword through him." "They must not kill him," I replied. "I have a better plan." "They will be hard to control once they are in the thick of a fight," Chiron assured me. "I have yet to see the officer who can do it. In the old days, in the days of the Jongs, there were order and discipline, but not now." "They will be aboard the Sofal," I averred. "Come with me. I'm going to speak to the men." Together we entered the lower deck house, where the majority of the ship's company was massed, waiting for the command to attack. There were nearly 100 rough and burly fighting men, nearly all of whom were ignorant and brutal. We had been together as commander and crew for too short a time for me to gauge their sentiments toward me, but I realized that there must be no question in any mind as to who was captain of the ship, no matter what they thought of me. Chiron had called them to attention as we entered, and now every eye was on me as I started to speak. "We are about to take another ship," I began, "on board which is one whom Chiron tells me you will want to kill. He is an Onjan. I have come here to tell you that he must not be killed." Growls of disapproval greeted this statement, but ignoring them, I continued, "I have come here to tell you something else, because I have been informed that no officer can control you after you enter battle. There are reasons why it will be better for us to hold this man prisoner than to kill him, but these have nothing to do with the question. What you must understand is that my orders and the orders of your other officers must be obeyed. We are embarked upon an enterprise that can succeed only if discipline be enforced. I expect the enterprise to succeed. I will enforce discipline. Insubordination or disobedience will be punishable by death. That is all." As I left the room, I left behind me nearly 100 silent men. There was nothing to indicate what their reaction had been. Purposely, I took Chiron out with me. I wanted the men to have an opportunity to discuss the matter among themselves without interference by an officer. I knew that I had no real authority over them. and that eventually they must decide for themselves whether they would obey me. The sooner that decision was reached, the better for all of us. Amtorian ships employ only the most primitive means of intercommunication. There is a crude and cumbersome hand signaling system in which flags are employed. Then there is a standardized system of trumpet calls which covers a fairly wide range of conventional messages. But the most satisfactory medium, and the one most used, is the human voice. Since our quarry had displayed the pennant of the Ongen, we had held a course parallel to hers and a little distance astern. On her main deck, a company of armed men was congregated. She mounted 4 guns, which had been elevated into firing position. She was ready, but I think that as yet she suspected nothing wrong in our intentions. Now I gave orders that caused the Sofal to close in upon the other ship, and as the distance between them lessened, I saw indications of increasing excitement on the decks of our intended victim. "What are you about?" shouted an officer from her tower deck. "Stand off there! There is an Onjan aboard us!" As no reply was made him, and as the Sofal continued to draw nearer, his excitement waxed. He gesticulated rapidly as he conversed with a fat man standing at his side. Then he screamed, "Stand off, or someone will suffer for this," but the Sofal only moved steadily closer. "Stand off, or I'll fire!" shouted the captain. For answer I caused all our starboard guns to be elevated into firing position. I knew he would not dare fire now, for a single broadside from the Sofal would have sunk him in less than a minute, a contingency which I wished to avoid as much as he. "What do you want of us?" he demanded. "We want to board you," I replied, "without bloodshed if possible." "This is revolution! This is treason!" shouted the fat man at the captain's side. "I order you to stand off and leave us alone. I am the Ongan, Musco." And then to the soldiers on the main deck he screamed, "Repel them! Kill any man who sets foot upon that deck." Chapter 13. Catastrophe. At the same moment that the Ongan, Musco, ordered his soldiers to repel any attempt to board his ship, her captain ordered full speed ahead and threw her helm to starboard. She veered away from us and leaped ahead in an effort to escape. Of course I could have sunk her, but her loot would have been of no value to me at the bottom of the sea. Instead, I directed the trumpeter at my side to sound full speed ahead to the officer in the tower, and the chase was on. The Yan, whose name was now discernible across her stern, was much faster than Chiron had led me to believe, but the Sofal was exceptionally speedy, and it soon became obvious to all that the other ship could not escape her. Slowly we regained the distance that we had lost in the first unexpected spurt of the Yan. Slowly but surely we were closing up on her. Then the captain of the Yan did just what I should have done had I been in his place. He kept the Sofal always directly astern of him, and opened fire on us with his after-tower gun and with a gun similarly placed in the stern on the lower deck. The maneuver was tactically faultless, since it greatly reduced the number of guns that we could bring into play without changing our course, and was the only one that might offer him any hope of escape. There was something eerie in the sound of that first heavy Amtorian gun that I had heard. I saw nothing, neither smoke nor flame. There was only a loud staccato roar, more reminiscent of machine gun fire than of any other sound. At first there was no other effect. Then I saw a piece of our starboard rail go, and 2 of my men fall to the deck. By this time our bow gun was in action. We were in the swell of the Yan's wake, which made accurate firing difficult. The 2 ships were racing ahead at full speed. The prow of the Sofal was throwing white water and spume far to either side. The sea in the wake of the Yan was boiling, and a heavy swell that we were quartering kept the ships rolling. The thrill of the chase and of battle was in our blood, and above all was the venomous rattle of the big guns. I ran to the bow to direct the fire of the gun there, and a moment later we had the satisfaction of seeing the crew of one of the Yan's guns crumple to the deck man by man, as our gunner got his sights on them and mowed them down. The Sofal was gaining rapidly upon the Yan, and our guns were concentrating on the tower gun and the tower of the enemy. The Onyan had long since disappeared from the upper deck. having doubtlessly sought safety in a less exposed part of the ship, and in fact there were only 2 men left alive upon the tower deck where he had stood beside the captain. These were 2 of the crew of the gun that was giving us most trouble. I did not understand at the time why the guns of neither ship were more effective. I knew that the T-ray was supposedly highly destructive, and so I could not understand why neither ship had been demolished or sunk. But that was because I had not yet learned that all the vital parts of the ships were protected by a thin armor of the same metal of which the large guns were composed, the only substance at all impervious to the T-ray. Had this not been true, our fire would have long since put the Yan out of commission, as our T-rays, directed upon her after-tower gun, would have passed on through the tower, killing the men at the controls and destroying the controls themselves. Eventually, this would have happened, but it would have been necessary first to have destroyed the protective armor of the tower. At last, we succeeded in silencing the remaining gun, but if we were to draw up alongside the Yan, we must expose ourselves to the fire of other guns located on her main deck and the forward end of the tower. We had already suffered some losses. I knew that we must certainly expect a great many more if we put ourselves in range of those other guns, but there seemed no other alternative than to abandon the chase entirely, and that I had no mind to do. Giving orders to draw up along her port side, I directed the fire of the bow gun along her rail, where it would rake her port guns one by one as we moved up on her, and gave orders that each of our starboard guns in succession should open fire similarly as they came within range of the Yan's guns. Thus we kept a steady and continuous fire streaming upon the unhappy craft as we drew alongside her and closed up the distance between us. We had suffered a number of casualties, but our losses were nothing compared to those of the Yan, whose decks were now strewn with dead and dying men. Her plight was hopeless, and her commander must at last have realized it, for now he gave the signal of surrender and stopped his engines. A few minutes later, we were alongside, and our boarding party had clambered over her rail. As Camlot and I stood watching these men, who were being led by Chiron to take possession of the prize and bring certain prisoners aboard the Sofal, I could not but speculate upon what their answer was to be to my challenge for leadership. I knew that their freedom from the constant menace of their tyrannical masters was so new to them that they might well be expected to commit excesses, and I dreaded the result. For I had determined to make an example of any men who disobeyed me, though I fell in the attempt. I saw the majority of them spread over the deck under the command of the great Zog, while Charon led a smaller detachment to the upper decks in search of the captain and the Ongen. Fully 5 minutes must have elapsed before I saw my lieutenant emerge from the tower of the Yan with his 2 prisoners. He conducted them down the companionway and across the main deck toward the Sofal, while 100 members of my pirate band watched them in silence. Not a hand was raised against them as they passed. Camlot breathed a sigh of relief as the 2 men clambered over the rail of the Sofal and approached us. "I think that our lives hung in the balance then, quite as much as theirs," he said, and I agreed with him. For if my men had started killing aboard the Yan in defiance of my orders, they would have had to kill me and those loyal to me to protect their own lives. The Ongan was still blustering when they were halted in front of me, but the captain was awed. There was something about the whole incident that mystified him, and when he got close enough to me to see the color of my hair and eyes, I could see that he was dumbfounded. "This is an outrage!" shouted Musko, the Ongan. "I will see that every last man of you is destroyed for this." He was trembling and purple with rage. "See that he does not speak again unless he is spoken to," I instructed Chiron, and then I turned to the captain. "As soon as we have taken what we wish from your ship," I told him, "you will be free to continue your voyage. I am sorry that you did not see fit to obey me when I ordered you to stop for boarding. It would have saved many lives. The next time you are ordered to lay to by the Sofal, do so, and when you return to your country, advise other shipmasters that the Sofal is abroad and that she is to be obeyed." "Do you mind telling me," he asked, who you are and under what flag you sail. For the moment, I am a Vepajan, I replied, but we sail under our own flag. No country is responsible for what we do, nor are we responsible to any country. Pressing the crew of the Yan into service, Camlot, Chiron, Gamfor, and Zog had all her weapons, such of her provisions as we wished, and the most valuable and least bulky portion of her cargo transferred to the Sofal before dark. We then threw her guns overboard and let her proceed upon her way. Musco I retained as a hostage in the event that we should ever need one. He was being held under guard on the main deck until I could determine just what to do with him. The Vepajan women captives we had rescued from the Sovong, together with our own officers, who were also quartered on the second deck, left me no vacant cabin in which to put Musco, and I did not wish to confine him below deck in the hole reserved for common prisoners. I chanced to mention the matter to Camlot in the presence of Villor, when the latter immediately suggested that he would share his own small cabin with Musco and be responsible for him. As this seemed an easy solution of the problem, I ordered Musco turned over to Villor, who took him at once to his cabin. The pursuit of the Yan had taken us off our course, and now as we headed once more toward Vepaja, a dark landmass was dimly visible to starboard. I could not but wonder what mysteries lay beyond that shadowy coastline, what strange beasts and men inhabited that terra incognita that stretched away into Strabol and the unexplored equatorial regions of Venus. To partially satisfy my curiosity, I went to the chart room, and after determining our position as accurately as I could by dead reckoning, I discovered that we were off the shore of Nubol. I remembered having heard Danus mention this country, but I could not recall what he had told me about it. Lured by imaginings, I went out onto the tower deck and stood alone, looking out across the faintly illuminated nocturnal waters of Amtor toward mysterious Nubol. The wind had risen to almost the proportions of a gale, the first that I had encountered since my coming to the Shepherd's Star. Heavy seas were commencing to run, but I had every confidence in the ship and in the ability of my officers to navigate her under any circumstances, so I was not perturbed by the increasing violence of the storm. It occurred to me, though, that the women aboard might be frightened, and my thoughts, which were seldom absent from her for long, returned to Douai. Perhaps she was frightened. Even no excuse is a good excuse to the man who wishes to see the object of his infatuation. But now I prided myself that I had a real reason for seeing her, and one that she herself must appreciate, since it was prompted by solicitude for her welfare. And so I went down the companionway to the second deck with the intention of whistling before the door of Douai, but as I had to pass directly by Villor's cabin, I thought that I would take the opportunity to look in on my prisoner. There was a moment's silence following my signal, and then Villor bade me enter. As I stepped into the cabin, I was surprised to see an Angan sitting there with Musco and Villor. Villor's embarrassment was obvious. Musco appeared ill at ease, and the birdman frightened. That they were disconcerted did not surprise me, for it is not customary for members of the superior race to fraternize with Klangen socially. But if they were embarrassed, I was not. I was more inclined to be angry. The position of the Vepajans aboard the Sofal was a delicate one. We were few in numbers, and our ascendancy depended wholly upon the respect we engendered and maintained in the minds of the Thorans, who constituted the majority of our company, and who looked up to the Vepajans as their superiors, despite the efforts of their leaders to convince them of the equality of all men. "Your quarters are forward," I said to the Angan. "You do not belong here." "It is not his fault," said Villor as the birdman rose to leave the cabin. Musco, strange as it may seem, had never seen an Angan, and I fetched this fellow here merely to satisfy his curiosity. I am sorry if I did wrong. "Of course," I said, "that puts a slightly different aspect on the matter, but I think it will be better if the prisoner inspects the Klangan on deck where they belong. He has my permission to do so tomorrow." The Angan departed. I exchanged a few more words with Villor, and then I left him with his prisoner and turned toward the after cabin where Douai was quartered. the episode that had just occurred fading from my mind almost immediately, to be replaced by far more pleasant thoughts. There was a light in Duare's cabin as I whistled before her door, wondering if she would invite me in or ignore my presence. For a time there was no response to my signal, and I had about determined that she would not see me when I heard her soft, low voice inviting me to enter. "You are persistent," she said, but there was less anger in her voice than when last she had spoken to me. "I came to ask if the storm has frightened you and to assure you that there is no danger." "I am not afraid," she replied. "Was that all that you wished to say?" It sounded very much like a dismissal. "No," I assured her, "nor did I come solely for the purpose of saying it." She raised her eyebrows. "What else could you have to say to me that you have not already said?" "Perhaps I wished to repeat," I suggested. "You must not," she cried. I came closer to her. "Look at me, Duai. Look me in the eyes and tell me that you do not like to hear me tell you that I love you." Her eyes fell. "I must not listen," she whispered, and rose as though to leave the room. I was mad with love for her. Her near presence sent the hot blood boiling through my veins. I seized her in my arms and drew her to me. Before she could prevent it, I covered her lips with mine. Then she partially tore away from me, and I saw a dagger gleaming in her hand. "You are right," I said. "Strike! I have done an unforgivable thing. My only excuse is my great love for you. It swept away reason and honor." Her dagger hand dropped to her side. "I cannot," she sobbed, and, turning, fled from the room. I went back to my own cabin, cursing myself for a beast and a cad. I could not understand how it had been possible for me to have committed such an unpardonable act. I reviled myself, and at the same time the memory of that soft body crushed against mine and those perfect lips against my lips suffused me with a warm glow of contentment that seemed far removed from repentance. I lay awake for a long time after I went to bed, thinking of Duai, recalling all that had ever passed between us. I found a hidden meaning in her cry, "I must not listen." I rejoiced in the facts that once she had refused to consign me to death at the hands of others, and that again she had refused to kill me herself. Her "I cannot" rang in my ears almost like an avowal of love. My better judgment told me that I was quite mad, but I found joy in hugging my madness to me. The storm increased to such terrific fury during the night that the screeching of the wind and the wild plunging of the sofal awakened me just before dawn. Arising immediately, I went on deck, where the wind almost carried me away. Great waves lifted the sofal on high, only to plunge her the next moment into watery abysses. The ship was pitching violently. Occasionally a huge wave broke across her bow and flooded the main deck. Across her starboard quarter loomed a great land mass that seemed perilously close. The situation appeared fraught with danger. I entered the control room and found both Honan and Gamfor with the helmsman. They were worried because of our proximity to land. Should either the engines or the steering device fail, we must inevitably be driven ashore. I told them to remain where they were, and then I went down to the second deck-house to arouse Kiran, Camlot, and Zog. As I turned aft from the foot of the companionway on the second deck, I noticed that the door of Villor's cabin was swinging open and closing again with each roll of the vessel. But I gave the matter no particular thought at the time, and passed on to awaken my other lieutenants. Having done so, I kept on to Duare's cabin, fearing that, if awake, she might be frightened by the rolling of the ship and the shrieking of the wind. To my surprise, I found her door swinging on its hinges. Something, I do not know what, aroused my suspicion that all was not right far more definitely than the rather unimportant fact that the door to her outer cabin was unlatched. Stepping quickly inside, I uncovered the light and glanced quickly about the room. There was nothing amiss except perhaps the fact that the door to the inner cabin where she slept was also open and swinging on its hinges. I was sure that no one could be sleeping in there while both those doors were swinging and banging. It was possible, of course, that Duai was too frightened to get up and close them. I stepped to the inner doorway and called her name aloud. There was no reply. I called again, louder. Again, silence was my only answer. Now I was definitely perturbed. Stepping into the room, I uncovered the light and looked at the bed. It was empty. Duai was not there. but in the far corner of the cabin lay the body of the man who had stood guard outside her door. Throwing conventions overboard, I hastened to each of the adjoining cabins where the rest of the Vepajan women were quartered. All were there except Duar. They had not seen her. They did not know where she was. Frantic from apprehension, I ran back to Camlot's cabin and acquainted him with my tragic discovery. He was stunned. "She must be on board," he cried. "Where else can she be?" "I know she must be," I replied, "but something tells me she is not. We must search the ship at once, from stem to stern." Zog and Chiron were emerging from their cabins as I came from Camlot's. I told them of my discovery and ordered the search commenced. Then I hailed a member of the watch and sent him to the crow's nest to question the lookout. I wanted to know whether he had seen anything unusual transpiring on the ship during his watch, for from his lofty perch he could overlook the entire vessel. "Muster every man," I told Camlot. "Account for every human being on board. Search every inch of the ship." As the men left to obey my instructions, I recalled the coincidence of the two cabin doors swinging wide, Duar's and Velor's. I could not imagine what relation either fact had to the other, but I was investigating everything, whether it was of a suspicious nature or not, so I ran quickly to Velor's cabin, and the moment that I uncovered the light, I saw that both Velor and Musco were missing. But where were they? No man could have left the Sofal in that storm and lived. Even could he have launched a boat, which would have been impossible of accomplishment, even in fair weather, without detection. Coming from Velor's cabin, I summoned a sailor and dispatched him to inform Camlot that Velor and Musco were missing from their cabin and direct him to send them to me as soon as he located them. Then I returned to the quarters of the Vepajan women for the purpose of questioning them more carefully. I was puzzled by the disappearance of Musco and Velor, which, taken in conjunction with the absence of Duai from her cabin, constituted a mystery of major proportions, and I was trying to discover some link of circumstance that might point a connection between the two occurrences, when I suddenly recalled Velor's insistence that he be permitted to guard Duar. Here was the first, faint suggestion of a connecting link. However, it seemed to lead nowhere. These three people had disappeared from their cabins, yet reason assured me that they would be found in a short time, since it was impossible for them to leave the ship unless... It was that little word "unless" that terrified me most of all. Since I had discovered that Duai was not in her cabin, a numbing fear had assailed me that, considering herself dishonored by my avowal of love, she had hurled herself overboard. Of what value now the fact that I constantly upbraided myself for my lack of consideration and control? Of what weight my vain regrets? Yet now I saw a tiny ray of hope. If the absence of Velor and Musco from their cabin and Duare from hers were more than a coincidence, then it was safe to assume that they were together and ridiculous to believe that all three had leaped overboard. With these conflicting fears and hopes whirling through my brain, I came to the quarters of the Vepajan women, which I was about to enter when the sailor I had sent to question the lookout in the crow's nest came running toward me in a state of evident excitement. "Well," I demanded, as breathless he halted before me, "what did the lookout have to say?" "Nothing, my captain," replied the man, his speech retarded by excitement and exertion. "Nothing. And why not?" I snapped. "The lookout is dead, my captain," gasped the sailor. "Dead! Murdered!" "How?" I asked. "A sword had been run through his body, from behind, I think. He lay upon his face. Go at once and inform Camlot. Tell him to replace the lookout and investigate his death, then to report to me." Shaken by this ominous news, I entered the quarters of the women. They were huddled together in one cabin, pale and frightened, but outwardly calm. "Have you found Duai?" one of them asked immediately. "No," I replied, "but I have discovered another mystery. The Onyan, Musco, is missing, and with him the Vepajan, Velor." "Vepajan!" exclaimed Baya, the woman who had questioned me concerning Duare. "Velor is no Vepajan." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "If he is not a Vepajan, what is he?" "He is a Thoran spy," she replied. "He was sent to Vepaja long ago to steal the secret of the longevity serum, and when we were captured the Klangan took him also by mistake. We learned this little by little aboard the Sovong." "But why was I not informed when he was brought aboard?" I demanded. "We supposed that everyone knew it," explained Bayer, "and thought that Villor was transferred to the Sofol as a prisoner." Another link in the chain of accumulating evidence. Yet I was as far as ever from knowing where either end of the chain lay. Chapter 14. Storm. After questioning the women, I went to the main deck, too impatient to await the reports of my lieutenants in the tower where I belonged. I found that they had searched the ship and were just coming to me with their report. None of those previously discovered missing had been found, but the search had revealed another astounding fact. The 5 Klangen also were missing. Searching certain portions of the ship had been rather dangerous work, as she was rolling heavily and the deck was still occasionally swept by the larger seas, but it had been accomplished without mishap, and the men were now congregated in a large room in the main deck-house. Camlot, Gampfer, Chiron, Zog, and I had also entered this same room where we were discussing the whole mysterious affair. Honan was in the control room of the tower. I told them that I had just discovered that Villor was not Vepajan but a Thoran spy, and had reminded Camlot of the man's request that he be allowed to guard the Janjong. I learned something else from Bayer while I was questioning the women, I added. During their captivity aboard the Sovong, Villor persisted in annoying Duare with his attentions. He was infatuated with her. I think that gives us the last bit of evidence we need to enable us to reconstruct the hitherto seemingly inexplicable happenings of the past night, said Gamfor. Villor wished to possess Duare. Musco wished to escape from captivity. The former had fraternized with the Klangan and made friends of them. That was known to everyone aboard the Sofal. Musco was an Onjan. During all their lives, doubtless, the Klangan have looked upon the Klongyan as the fountainheads of supreme authority. They would believe his promises, and they would obey his commands. Doubtless, Villor and Musco worked out the details of the plot together. They dispatched an Angan to kill the lookout, lest their movements arouse suspicion and be reported before they could carry their plan to a successful conclusion. The lookout disposed of, the other Klangan congregated in Villor's cabin. Then Villor, probably accompanied by Musco, went to the cabin of Duare, where they killed the guard and seized her in her sleep, silenced her with a gag, and carried her to the gangway outside, where the Klangan were waiting. A gale was blowing, it is true, but it was blowing toward land which lay but a short distance to starboard, and the Klangan are powerful flyers. There you have what I believe to be a true picture of what happened aboard the Sofal while we slept. And you believe that the Klangan carried these 3 people to the shores of Nubal? I asked. I think there can be no question but that such is the fact, replied Gamfer. I quite agree with him, interjected Camlot. Then there is but one thing to do, I announced. We must turn back and land a searching party on Nubal. No boat could live in this sea, objected Chiron. The storm will not last forever, I reminded him. We shall lie off the shore until it abates. I am going up to the tower. I wish you men would remain here and question the crew. It is possible that there may be someone among them who has overheard something that will cast new light on the subject. The Klangan are great talkers, and they may have dropped some remark that will suggest the ultimate destination Villor and Musco had in mind. As I stepped out onto the main deck, the Sofal rose upon the crest of a great wave and then plunged nose downward into the watery abyss beyond, tilting the deck forward at an angle of almost 45 degrees. The wet and slippery boards beneath my feet gave them no hold, and I slid helplessly forward almost 50 feet before I could check my descent. Then the ship buried her nose in a mountainous wave, and a great wall of water swept the deck from stem to stern, picking me up and whirling me helplessly upon its crest. For a moment I was submerged, and then a vagary of the Titan that had seized me brought my head above the water, and I saw the Sofal rolling and pitching 50 feet away. Even in the immensity of interstellar space, I had never felt more helpless nor more hopeless than I did at that moment on the storm-lashed sea of an unknown world, surrounded by darkness and chaos, and what terrible creatures of this mysterious deep I could not even guess. I was lost, Even if my comrades knew of the disaster that had overwhelmed me, they were helpless to give me aid. No boat could live in that sea, as Chiron had truly reminded us, and no swimmer could breast the terrific onslaught of those racing, wind-driven mountains of water that might no longer be described by so puny a word as wave. Hopeless! I should not have said that. I am never without hope. If I could not swim against the sea, perhaps I might swim with it, and at no great distance lay land. I am an experienced distance swimmer and a powerful man. If any man could survive in such a sea, I knew that I could. But if I could not, I was determined that I should at least have the satisfaction of dying fighting. I was hampered by no clothes, as one could scarcely dignify the Amtorian loincloth with the name of clothing. My only impediment was my weapons, and these I hesitated to discard, knowing that my chances for survival on that unfriendly shore would be slight were I unarmed. Neither the belt, nor the pistol, nor the dagger inconvenienced me, and their weight was negligible. But the sword was a different matter. If you have never tried swimming with a sword dangling from your middle, do not attempt it in a heavy sea. You might think that it would hang straight down and not get in the way, but mine did not. The great waves hurled me about mercilessly, twisting and turning me, and now my sword was buffeting me in some tender spot, and now it was getting between my legs. And once, when a wave turned me completely over, it came down on top of me and struck me on the head. Yet I would not discard it. After the first few minutes of battling with the sea, I concluded that I was in no immediate danger of being drowned. I could keep my head above the waves often enough and long enough to ensure sufficient air for my lungs, and the water being warm, I was in no danger of being chilled to exhaustion, as so often occurs when men are thrown into cold seas. Therefore, as closely as I could anticipate any contingency in this unfamiliar world, there remained but two major and immediate threats against my life. The first lay in the possibility of attack by some ferocious monster of the Amtorian deeps. The second, and by far the more serious, the storm-lashed shore upon which I must presently attempt to make a safe landing. This in itself should have been sufficient to dishearten me, for I had seen seas breaking upon too many shores to lightly ignore the menace of those incalculable tons of hurtling waters, pounding, crashing, crushing, tearing their way even into the rocky heart of the eternal hills. I swam slowly in the direction of the shore, which, fortunately for me, was in the direction that the storm was carrying me. I had no mind to sap my strength by unnecessarily overexerting myself, and so, as I took it easily, content to keep afloat as I moved slowly shoreward, daylight came, and as each succeeding wave lifted me to its summit, I saw the shore with increasing clearness. It lay about a mile from me, and its aspect was most forbidding. Huge combers were breaking upon a rocky coastline, throwing boiling fountains of white spume high in air. Above the howling of the tempest, the thunder of the surf rolled menacingly across that mile of angry sea to warn me that death lay waiting to embrace me at the threshold of safety. I was in a quandary. Death lay all about me. It remained but for me to choose the place and manner of the assignation. I could drown where I was, or I could permit myself to be dashed to pieces on the rocks. Neither eventuality aroused any considerable enthusiasm in my breast. As a mistress, death seemed sadly lacking in many essentials. Therefore, I decided not to die. Thoughts may be, as has been said, things, but they are not everything. No matter how favorably I thought of living, I knew that I must also do something about it. My present situation offered me no chance of salvation. The shore alone could give me life, so I struck out for the shore. As I drew nearer it, many things, some of them quite irrelevant, passed through my mind, but some were relevant, among them the burial service. It was not a nice time to think of this, but then we cannot always control our thoughts. However, in the midst of life we are in death, seemed wholly appropriate to my situation. By twisting it a bit, I achieved something that contained the germ of hope. In the midst of death there is life. Perhaps the tall waves lifting me high afforded me for brief instants vantage points from which I could view the death ahead, in the midst of which I sought for life. The shoreline was becoming, at closer range, something more than an unbroken line of jagged rocks and white water, but details were yet lacking. for each time I was allowed but a brief glimpse before being dropped once more to the bottom of a watery chasm. My own efforts, coupled with the fury of the gale driving me shoreward, brought me rapidly to the point where I should presently be seized by the infuriated seas and hurled upon the bombarded rocks that reared their jagged heads bleakly above the swirling waters of each receding comber. A great wave lifted me upon its crest and carried me forward. The end had come. With the speed of a racehorse, it swept me toward my doom. A welter of spume engulfed my head. I was twisted and turned as a cork in a whirlpool. Yet I struggled to lift my mouth above the surface for an occasional gasp of air. I fought to live for a brief moment longer, that I might not be dead when I was dashed by the merciless sea against the merciless rocks. Thus dominating is the urge to live. I was carried on. Moments seemed an eternity. Where were the rocks? I almost yearned for them now to end the bitterness of my futile struggle. I thought of my mother and of Douai. I even contemplated, with something akin to philosophic calm, the strangeness of my end. In that other world that I had left forever, no creature would ever have knowledge of my fate. Thus spoke the eternal egotism of man, who even in death desires an audience. Now I caught a brief glimpse of rocks. They were upon my left when they should have been in front of me. It was incomprehensible. The wave tore on, carrying me with it, and still I lived, and there was only water against my naked flesh. Now the fury of the sea abated. I rose to the crest of a diminishing comber to look with astonishment upon the comparatively still waters of an inlet. I had been carried through the rocky gateway of a landlocked cove, and before me I saw a sandy crescent beach. I had escaped the black fingers of death. I had been the beneficiary of a miracle. The sea gave me a final fillip that rolled me high upon the sands to mingle with the wrack and flotsam she had discarded. I stood up and looked about me. A more devout man would have given thanks, but I felt that as yet I had been spared temporarily, but Douai was still in peril. The cove into which I had been swept was formed by the mouth of a canyon that ran inland between low hills, the sides and summits of which were dotted with small trees. Nowhere did I see any such giants as grow in Vapaja, but perhaps, I mused, what I see here are not trees on Venus, but only underbrush. However, I shall call them trees, since many of them were from 50 to 80 feet in height. A little river tumbled down the canyon's bottom to empty into the cove. Pale violet grass, starred with blue and purple flowers, bordered it and clothed the hills. There were trees with red boles, smooth and glossy as lacquer. There were trees with azure boles. Whipping in the gale was the same weird foliage of heliotrope and lavender and violet that had rendered the forests of Vapaja so unearthly to my eyes. But beautiful and unusual as was the scene, it could not claim my undivided attention. A strange freak of fate had thrown me upon this shore, to which, I had reason to believe, Douai must undoubtedly have been carried. And now my only thought was to take advantage of this fortunate circumstance and attempt to find and succour her. I could only assume that in the event her abductors had brought her to this shore, their landing must have been made farther along the coast to my right, which was the direction from which the Sofol had been moving. With only this slight and unsatisfactory clue, I started immediately to scale the side of the canyon and commence my search. At the summit, I paused a moment to survey the surrounding country and get my bearings. Before me stretched a rolling tableland, tree-dotted and lush with grass, and beyond that, inland, rose a range of mountains, vague and mysterious, along the distant horizon. My course lay to the east. Along the coast, I shall use the earthly references to points of compass. The mountains were northward, toward the equator. I am assuming, of course, that I am in the southern hemisphere of the planet. The sea was south of me. I glanced in that direction, looking for the Sofol. There she was, far out and moving toward the east. Evidently my orders were being carried out, and the Sofol was lying offshore waiting for calm weather that would permit a landing. Now I turned my steps toward the east. At each elevation I stopped and scanned the tableland in all directions, searching for some sign of those I sought. I saw signs of life, but not of human life. Herbivorous animals grazed in large numbers upon the flower-starred violet plain. Many that were close enough to be seen plainly appeared similar in form to earthly animals, but there was none exactly like anything I had ever seen on earth. Their extreme wariness and the suggestion of speed and agility in their conformations suggested that they had enemies. The wariness that among these enemies was man, the speed and agility that swift and ferocious carnivores preyed upon them. These observations served to warn me that I must be constantly on the alert for similar dangers that might threaten me, and I was glad that the tableland was well supplied with trees growing at convenient intervals. I had not forgotten the ferocious basto that Camlot and I had encountered in Vipaja, and, though I had seen nothing quite so formidable as yet among the nearer beasts, there were some creatures grazing at a considerable distance from me whose lines suggested a too great similarity to those bison-like omnivores to ensure ease of mind. I moved rather rapidly, as I was beset by fears for Duai's safety, and felt that if I did not come upon some clue this first day, my search might prove fruitless. The Klangen, I believed, must have alighted near the coast, where they would have remained at least until daylight, and my hope was that they might have tarried longer. If they had winged away immediately, my chances of locating them were slight. And now my only hope lay in the slender possibility that I might come across them before they took up their flight for the day. The tableland was cut by gullies and ravines running down to the sea. Nearly all of these carried streams varying in size from tiny rivulets to those which might be dignified by the appellation of river, but none that I encountered offered any serious obstacle to my advance, though upon one or two occasions I was forced to swim the deeper channels. If these rivers were inhabited by dangerous reptiles, I saw nothing of them, though I admit that they were constantly on my mind as I made my way from bank to bank. Once, upon the tableland, I saw a large cat-like creature at a distance, apparently stalking a herd of what appeared to be a species of antelope. But either it did not see me or was more interested in its natural prey, for although I was in plain sight, it paid no attention to me. Shortly thereafter I dropped into a small gully, and when I had regained the higher ground upon the opposite side, the beast was no longer in sight. But even had it been, it would have been driven from my thoughts by faint sounds that came to me out of the distance far ahead. There were what sounded like the shouts of men and the unmistakable hum of Amtorian pistol fire. Though I searched diligently with my eyes to the far horizon, I could see no sign of the authors of these noises, but it was enough for me to know that there were human beings ahead and that there was fighting there. Being only human, I naturally pictured the woman I loved in the center of overwhelming dangers, even though my better judgment told me that the encounter reverberating in the distance might have no connection with her or her abductors. Reason aside, however, I broke into a run, and as I advanced, the sounds waxed louder. They led me finally to the rim of a considerable canyon, the bottom of which formed a level valley of entrancing loveliness, through which wound a river far larger than any I had yet encountered. But neither the beauty of the valley nor the magnitude of the river held my attention for but an instant. Down there upon the floor of that nameless canyon was a scene that gripped my undivided interest and left me cold with apprehension. Partially protected by an outcropping of rock at the river's edge, 6 figures crouched or lay. 5 of them were Klangen, the 6th a woman. It was Duare. Facing them, hiding behind trees and rocks, were a dozen hairy, man-like creatures, hurling rocks from slings at the beleaguered 6 or loosing crude arrows from still cruder bows. The savages and the Klangen were hurling taunts and insults at one another, as well as missiles. It was these sounds that I had heard from a distance, blending with the staccato hum of the Klangen's pistols. 3 of the Klangen lay motionless upon the turf behind their barrier, apparently dead. The remaining Klangen and Duare crouched with pistols in their hands, defending their position and their lives. The savages cast their stone missiles directly at the 3 whenever one of them showed any part of his body above the rocky breastwork, but the arrows they discharged into the air so that they fell behind the barrier. Scattered about among the trees and behind rocks were the bodies of fully a dozen hairy savages who had fallen before the fire of the Klangen. But while Duare's defenders had taken heavy toll of the enemy, the outcome of the unequal battle could have been only the total destruction of the Klangen, and Duare had it lasted much longer. The details, which have taken long in the telling, I took in at a single glance, nor did I waste precious time in pondering the best course of action. At any moment, one of those crude arrows might pierce the girl I loved, and so my first thought was to divert the attention of the savages, and perhaps their fire from their intended victims to me. I was slightly behind their position, which gave me an advantage, as also did the fact that I was above them. Yelling like a Comanche, I leaped down the steep side of the canyon, firing my pistol as I charged. Instantly the scene below me changed. The savages, taken partially from the rear and unexpectedly menaced by a new enemy, leaped to their feet in momentary bewilderment, and simultaneously the two remaining Klangen, recognizing me and realizing that succor was at hand, sprang from the shelter of their barrier and ran forward to complete the demoralization of the savages. Together we shot down 6 of the enemy before the rest finally turned and fled. But they were not routed before one of the Klangen was struck full between the eyes by a jagged bit of rock. I saw him fall, and when we were no longer menaced by a foe, I went to him, thinking that he was only stunned. But at that time I had no conception of the force with which these primitive ape-like men cast the missiles from their slings. The fellow's skull was crushed, and a portion of the missile had punctured his brain. He was quite dead when I reached him. Then I hastened to Duare. She was standing with a pistol in her hand, tired and dishevelled, but otherwise apparently little worse for the harrowing experiences through which she had passed. I think that she was glad to see me, for she certainly must have preferred me to the hairy ape-man from which I had been instrumental in rescuing her. Yet a trace of fear was reflected in her eyes, as though she were not quite sure of the nature of the treatment she might expect from me. To my shame, her fears were justified by my past behavior, but I was determined that she should never again have cause to complain of me. I would win her confidence and trust, hoping that love might follow in their wake. There was no light of welcome in her eyes as I approached her, and that hurt me more than I can express. Her countenance reflected more a pathetic resignation to whatever new trials my presence might portend. "You have not been harmed?" I asked. "You are all right?" "Quite," she replied. Her eyes passed beyond me, searching the summit of the canyon wall down which I had charged upon the savages. "Where are the others?" she asked in puzzled and slightly troubled tones. "What others?" I inquired. "Those who came with you from the Sofal to search for me." "There were no others. I am quite alone." Her countenance assumed an even deeper gloom at this announcement. "Why did you come alone?" she asked fearfully. "To be honest with you, it was through no fault of my own that I came at all at this time," I explained. "After we missed you from the Sofal, I gave orders to stand by off the coast until the storm abated and we could land a searching party. Immediately thereafter, I was swept overboard, a most fortunate circumstance as it turned out, and naturally, when I found myself safely ashore, my first thought was of you. I was searching for you when I heard the shouts of the savages and the sound of pistol fire." "You came in time to save me from them," she said. "But for what? What are you going to do with me now?" "I am going to take you to the coast as quickly as possible," I replied, "and there we will signal the Sofal. She will send a boat to take us off." Duare appeared slightly relieved at this recital of my plans. "You will win the undying gratitude of the Jong, my father, if you return me to Vipaja unharmed," she said. "To have served his daughter shall be reward enough for me," I replied, "even though I succeed in winning not even her gratitude." "That you already have for what you have just done at the risk of your life," she assured me, and there was more graciousness in her voice than before. "What became of Villor and Musco?" I asked. Her lip curled in scorn. "When the Clunobargan attacked us, they fled." "Where did they go?" I asked. "They swam the river and ran away in that direction." She pointed toward the east. "Why did the Klangen not desert you also? They were told to protect me." "They know little else than to obey their superiors, and too they like to fight. Having little intelligence and no imagination, they are splendid fighters." I cannot understand why they did not fly away from danger and take you with them when they saw that defeat was certain. That would have ensured the safety of all. By the time they were assured of that, it was too late, she explained. They could not have risen from behind our protection without being destroyed by the missiles of the Clunabargen. This word, by way of parenthesis, is an interesting example of the derivation of an Amtorian substantive. Broadly, it means savages. Literally, it means hairy men. In the singular, it is no bargain. Gan is man, bar is hair. No is a contraction of not with, and is used as a prefix with the same value that the suffix y has in English. Therefore, nobar means hairy. Nobargan, hairy man. The prefix clu forms the plural, and we have Clunabargen, hairy men, savages. After determining that the 4 Clangen were dead, Duar, the remaining Angan, and I started down the river toward the ocean. On the way, Duari told me what had occurred on board the Sofal the preceding night, and I discovered that it had been almost precisely as Gamfor had pictured it. "What was their object in taking you with them?" I asked. "Vilo wanted me," she replied. "And Musco merely wished to escape." "Yes, he thought that he would be killed when the ship reached Vapaja." "How did they expect to survive in a wild country like this?" I asked. "Did they know where they were?" "They said that they thought that the country was Nubal," she replied, "but they were not positive. The Thorans have agents in Nubal who are fomenting discord in an attempt to overthrow the government. There are several of these in a city on the coast, and it was Musco's intention to search for this city, where he was certain that he would find friends who would be able to arrange transportation for himself, Vilor, and me to Thora." We walked on in silence for some time. I was just ahead of Duare, and the Angan brought up the rear. He was crestfallen and dejected. His head and tail feathers drooped. The Klangan are ordinarily so vociferous that this preternatural silence attracted my attention, and, thinking that he might have been injured in the fight, I questioned him. "I was not wounded, my captain," he replied. "Then what is the matter with you? Are you sad because of the deaths of your comrades?" "It is not that," he replied. "There are plenty more where they came from. It is because of my own death that I am sad." "But you are not dead." "I shall be soon," he averred. "What makes you think so?" I demanded. "When I return to the ship, they will kill me for what I did last night. If I do not return, I shall be killed here. No one could live alone for long in such a country as this. If you serve me well and obey me, you will not be killed if we succeed in reaching the Sofal again," I assured him. At that he brightened perceptibly. "I shall serve you well and obey you, my captain," he promised, and presently he was smiling and singing again, as though he had not a single care in the world, and there was no such thing as death. On several occasions, when I had glanced back at my companions, I had discovered Duar's eyes upon me, and in each instance she had turned them away quickly, as though I had surprised and embarrassed her in some questionable act. I had spoken to her only when necessary, for I had determined to atone for my previous conduct by maintaining a purely official attitude toward her that would reassure her and give her no cause for apprehension as to my intentions. This was a difficult role for me to play, while I yearned to take her into my arms and tell her again of the great love that was consuming me. But I had succeeded so far in controlling myself, and saw no reason to believe that I should not be able to continue to do so, at least as long as Duar continued to give me no encouragement. The very idea that she might give me encouragement caused me to smile in spite of myself. Presently, much to my surprise, she said, "You are very quiet. What is the matter?" It was the first time that Duar had ever opened a conversation with me or given me any reason to believe that I existed for her as a personality. I might have been a clod of earth or a piece of furniture, for all the interest she had seemed to take in me since those 2 occasions upon which I had surprised her as she watched me from the concealing foliage of her garden. "There is nothing the matter with me," I assured her. "I am only concerned with your welfare and the necessity for getting you back to the Sofal as quickly as possible." "You do not talk any more," she complained. "Formerly, when I saw you, you used to talk a great deal." "Probably altogether too much," I admitted, "but you see, now I am trying not to annoy you." Her eyes fell to the ground. "It would not annoy me. she said almost inaudibly, but now that I was invited to do the very thing that I had been longing to do, I became dumb. I could think of nothing to say. "You see," she continued in her normal voice, "conditions are very different now from any that I have ever before encountered. The rules and restrictions under which I have lived among my own people cannot, I now realize, be expected to apply to situations so unusual or to people and places so foreign to those whose lives they were intended to govern. I have been thinking a great deal about many things, and you. I commenced to think these strange thoughts after I saw you the first time in the garden at Kuad. I have thought that perhaps it might be nice to talk to other men than those I am permitted to see in the house of my father, the Jong. I became tired of talking to these same men and to my women, but custom had made a slave and a coward of me. I did not dare do the things I most wished to do. I always wanted to talk to you. And now, for the brief time before we shall be again aboard the Sofal, where I must again be governed by the laws of Vepaja, I am going to be free. I am going to do what I wish. I am going to talk to you." This naive declaration revealed a new Duare, one in the presence of whom it was going to be most difficult to maintain an austere platonicism. Yet I continued to steel myself to the carrying out of my resolve. "Why do you not talk to me?" She demanded when I made no immediate comment on her confession. "I do not know what to talk about," I admitted, "unless I talk about the one thing that is uppermost in my mind." She was silent for a moment, her brows knit in thought, and then she asked with seeming innocence, "What is that?" "Love," I said, looking into her eyes. They were still some distance away when we saw the Sofal change her course and point her bow toward shore. Our signal had been seen, and our comrades were coming to investigate, but would they be in time? For us it was a thrilling race. The wind had sprung up again, and the sea was rising once more. I asked the Angan if he could breast the gale, for I determined to send Duare off at once if I received a favourable reply. "I could alone," he said, "but I doubt that I could if I were carrying another." We watched the Sofal plunging and wallowing in the rising sea as it forged steadily closer, and we watched the men drawing near with equal certainty. There was no doubt in my mind as to which would reach us first. My only hope now was that the Sofal could lessen the distance in the meantime sufficiently so that it would be safe for the Angan to attempt to carry Duare to her. Now the men had reached the summit of the cliff on the opposite side of the canyon, and here they halted and observed us while carrying on a discussion of some nature. "Vilor is with them!" exclaimed Duare suddenly. "And Musco," I added. "I see them both now." "What shall we do?" cried Duare. "Oh, they must not get me again!" "They shall not," I promised her. Down the canyon side they came now. We watched them swim the river and cross to the foot of the cliff where we were standing. We watched the Sofal creeping slowly shoreward. I went to the edge of the cliff and looked down upon the ascending men. They were halfway up now. Then I returned to Duare and the Angan. "We can wait no longer," I said, and then to the Angan, "Take the Janjong and fly to the ship. She is closer now. You can make it. You must make it." He started to obey, but Duare drew away from him. "I will not go," she said quietly. "I will not leave you here alone." For those words I would gladly have laid down my life. Here again was still another Duare. I had expected nothing like this, for I did not feel that she owed me any such loyalty. It was not as though she had loved me. One might expect such self-sacrifice on the part of a woman for the man she loves. I was swept completely from my feet, but only for an instant. The enemy, if such it were, must by now be almost to the summit of the cliff. In a moment they would be upon us, and even as the thought touched my mind, I saw the first of them running toward us. "Take her!" I cried to the Angan. "There is no time to waste now." He reached for her, but she attempted to elude him, and then I caught her, and as I touched her, all my good resolutions were swept away as I felt her in my arms. I pressed her to me for an instant. I kissed her, and then I gave her over to the birdman. "Hurry!" I cried. "They come!" Spreading his powerful wings, he rose from the ground, while Duare stretched her hands toward me. "Do not send me away from you, Carson! Do not send me away! I love you!" But it was too late. I would not have called her back, could I have done so, for the armed men were upon me. Thus I went into captivity in the land of Nubal, an adventure that is no part of this story. But I went with the knowledge that the woman I loved loved me, and I was happy. This concludes The Pirates of Venus by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Be sure to hit like and subscribe and browse the Sci-Fi Classics audiobook library and playlists.